The morning sun over Fort Carson was weak, doing little to cut through the bitter Colorado chill that seeped through the thin walls of the battalion's physical training hall. Sergeant First Class Marcus Hammer Hogan stood at the front of the formation, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, a standard-issue stopwatch dangling from his thick neck. He watched the soldiers file in, their breath misting in the air, the sound of heavy boots echoing off the concrete floor. Physical training was sacred to Hogan. It was the great equalizer, the forge where weak links were either strengthened or broken. He had been in the Army for 16 years, and in his mind, excuses were a luxury that combat did not afford. As the formation settled, his eyes scanned the rows and landed on a soldier who immediately sparked his irritation. As Specialist Maria Ramirez stood near the back, still bundled in her heavy winter coat. While the other soldiers were already stripping down to their PT gear, gray t-shirts and black shorts, Ramirez stood with her arms wrapped around herself, the bulky coat zipped up to her chin. Hogan's jaw tightened. He checked his stopwatch. 2 minutes until the run started. "Ramirez!" His voice cut through the low murmur of the crowd like a knife. "What the hell are you still doing in that coat? You planning on sleeping in it? Fall out and get in gear." Specialist Ramirez flinched slightly at the sound of her name. She was a good soldier, had been for the 5 years she'd been in. She kept her head down, her qualifications current, and her weapon clean. But lately, keeping her head down had become a full-time job. She looked up at the first sergeant, at her face pale. "First Sergeant, I need to request a medical excuse from the run today." The room went quiet. Soldiers who had been tying their boots paused, their ears pricking up at the exchange. Hogan uncrossed his arms and walked toward her, his boots clacking with deliberate intent. "A medical excuse," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "You look fine to me, Ramirez. You weren't on sick call this morning. You didn't put in a chit." It came on suddenly, First Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I can't run today." Hogan stopped directly in front of her. He was a head taller, and he used every inch of that height to loom. He had seen this before, soldiers trying to skate out of a hard session, looking for a warm place to hide while everyone else did the work. In his book, that was worse than cowardice. It was theft. Theft from the unit, from the team. "Suddenly," he mimicked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He turned to address the rest of the formation, playing to his audience. "You hear that? She can't run. She's got a sudden boo-boo." A few soldiers chuckled nervously, the kind of laughter born from the relief that they weren't the ones in the crosshairs. Hogan turned back to Ramirez, his eyes narrowing. "You know what I think, Specialist? I think you got soft. I think you figured it's cold out, and you'd rather sip coffee in the barracks than sweat with your brothers and sisters." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that still carried in the silent hall. "I've been doing this job since you were in diapers. I've seen every excuse in the book. A sudden pain? That's the oldest trick. It's an insult to my intelligence, and more importantly, it's an insult to these soldiers who are about to go out there and bleed for their fitness. You don't want to run? Fine, but don't you dare stand there and lie to me." Maria's knuckles were white, where she gripped the edges of her coat. A storm of emotions raged behind her eyes, humiliation, anger, and a deep, gnawing exhaustion. She wasn't trying to get out of the work. She was trying to survive it. The physical act of running, the jarring motion, the impact, it was agony. But explaining that meant exposing a part of herself she kept locked away, a part that didn't fit the image of a squared-away NCO. "I'm not lying, First Sergeant," she whispered. Hogan threw his hands up in a gesture of mock exasperation. "Not lying? She's not lying, she says. So, what is it? You got a cold? Your feet hurt? Maybe you got a splinter? The laughter from the formation grew a little louder. Someone at the back muttered, "Probably just that time of the month," earning a few sniggers. Hogan didn't shut it down. He let the ridicule hang in the air like a weapon. Maria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had survived things that would make Hogan flinch. She had held her best friend's hand while the life bled out of her on a dusty road. She had felt the white-hot sear of metal tear through her own flesh. She had earned the right to stand here in this freezing hall without being shamed. But the military was a strange beast. It worshipped strength and shunned vulnerability. To admit weakness was to invite the wolves. "Tell you what, Ramirez," Hogan said, and stepping back and crossing his arms again. "Since you're so determined to sit this one out, why don't you show us all what's so wrong? You're hiding in that coat like it's a bunker. Open it up. Show us the big, terrible injury that means you can't run a mile with your unit." The demand was meant to be the final blow. He expected her to crumble, to admit defeat, and to slink away to the barracks in shame. He expected her to save face by admitting the lie. He did not expect her to look him dead in the eye, her gaze as hard as the steel in a rifle barrel, and reach for her zipper. The silence that fell over the PT hall was absolute. You could hear the distant rumble of a truck engine outside, the hum of the fluorescent lights. Every soldier in that room was frozen, watching the scene unfold. Maria's hands moved slowly, deliberately. As she pulled the zipper down, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. She shrugged the heavy coat off her shoulders, letting it fall to the concrete floor in a heap. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a sharp gasp escaped from a female soldier near the front. Hogan's face, which had been set in a smug smirk of anticipated victory, went slack. His eyes widened, the color draining from his ruddy cheeks. Standing before him, Specialist Maria Ramirez was wearing her regulation PT shorts and a T-shirt. But the T-shirt wasn't intact. The left side of the gray fabric was bunched and twisted, and just below the rib cage, a massive chunk of the shirt was simply missing, the edges scarred and melted, and beneath the hole in the fabric, there was no smooth skin. There was a landscape of trauma, a thick, ropey keloid scar, on the color of deep purple and angry red, twisted across her abdomen. It was a wound that looked more like an explosion than an incision. The skin was puckered and grafted, a testament to the violence that had created it. Hogan stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The scar was horrifying, not because it was ugly, but because of what it represented. It was a combat wound, the kind you get from an IED, from shrapnel tearing through a vehicle. It was the kind of wound that sent soldiers home in boxes. Maria's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You wanted to see, First Sergeant. So, look." She gestured to the scar. "This is what's left of an EFP, an explosively formed projectile that went through our truck in Kandahar. It killed Private First Class Miller instantly. The heat melted my shirt into my skin. They had to cut the fabric out of the wound in the field hospital." She took a step closer to him, and for the first time, Hogan flinched. "The doctors reconstructed my abdomen. They took skin from my thigh to cover the hole. The muscles underneath don't work the same way anymore. When I run, it feels like I'm being ripped open from the inside. That's why I can't run today." The silence continued, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of anticipation, but the heavy, suffocating silence of shame. The soldiers who had laughed looked at their boots. The one who had made the crude joke wished the floor would swallow him whole. Hogan stood frozen, the mighty first sergeant stripped of his authority by the quiet dignity of the soldier he had just ridiculed. The PT formation dissolved into chaos, but it was a silent, orderly kind of chaos. No one spoke above a whisper. Hogan, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror, had simply raised a hand and dismissed the company with a choked, "Hit the showers! Run is canceled!" It was an unprecedented move. Physical training was never canceled. But then again, First Sergeant Hogan had never before been publicly eviscerated by the truth. Maria stood alone for a long moment after the soldiers dispersed. She bent slowly, wincing at the movement, and picked up her coat. The action was agonizing, a stark visual reminder of the damage hidden beneath her clothes. As she straightened up, a young private, a boy fresh out of basic training with a face still smooth and unlined by hardship, approached her hesitantly. He held out her water bottle, which she had dropped during the confrontation. "Specialist Ramirez," he stammered, unable to meet her eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't know." Maria took the bottle, her fingers brushing his. She saw the genuine remorse in his young face and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She wasn't angry at him. She was angry at the system, at the culture that demanded perfection and punished vulnerability, at the assumption that a soldier's worth was measured only by their physical output. "It's okay, Private. You weren't supposed to know." She walked out of the PT hall and into the weak morning sun. The cold air hit her face, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the confrontation she had just endured. She didn't go to the barracks. Instead, she walked toward the administrative building, her feet carrying her on autopilot. She needed to see the chaplain, or maybe just find a quiet corner where she could sit and let the adrenaline drain from her system. The encounter with Hogan had ripped the scab off a wound that was far deeper than the one on her abdomen. It had exposed the raw, psychic pain she carried every day. The survivor's guilt, the nightmares, the flashbacks. Meanwhile, in his office, Sergeant First Class Hogan sat heavily in his chair, the cheap vinyl groaning under his weight. The door was closed, the blinds drawn. He stared at the wall, but he didn't see the recruitment posters or the unit citations. He saw the scar. That terrible, purple, angry scar. He saw the hole in the shirt. He saw her eyes, devoid of tears, devoid of pleading, filled only with a quiet, devastating strength. He replayed his own words in his head. You got soft. A sudden boo-boo. Open your coat." He had demanded she expose herself, literally, to prove her weakness, and she had. But she hadn't exposed weakness. She had exposed the ultimate proof of her sacrifice. She had been hit by an IED. She had watched her friend die. She had been reconstructed by surgeons. And she was still here, still serving, still showing up for PT. Hogan had never deployed. It was the unspoken shame of his career. He had been a rear echelon soldier during the big surges, a drill sergeant stateside, a garrison first sergeant. He had trained soldiers, yelled at soldiers, and shaped soldiers, but he had never been shot at. He had never felt the earth shake from a blast. He had never held a dying friend. To compensate, he had built his identity around the hard army, the physical army, the army of discipline and punishment. He had confused cruelty with rigor. His hands were shaking. He pulled open his bottom desk drawer and retrieved a bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. He unscrewed the cap and took a long, burning gulp, not bothering with a cup. The liquor scorched his throat, but it did nothing to quell the nausea rising in his gut. He had spent his entire career demanding respect, demanding performance, and judging those he perceived as weak. Today, he had been judged, and he had been found terrifyingly wanting. He thought about what came next. There would be an investigation, surely. He had humiliated a wounded soldier in front of the entire company. The battalion commander would hear about it. His career, The only thing he had ever been good at flashed before his eyes. Retirement in disgrace. And whispers in the NCO Corps. Remember Hogan? The guy who made the Purple Heart vet show her scars? But beneath the fear for his career, something else was stirring. Something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. It was a crack in the wall of his certainty. For 16 years, he had operated on a simple binary, strong and weak. Physical fitness equaled mental fitness. Pain was weakness leaving the body. But Ramirez had endured more pain in 1 second than he had in his entire career. Her body was literally broken, yet she continued to serve. By his own definition, she was the strongest person in the unit, and he had just tried to destroy her. He took another gulp of whiskey, welcoming the numbness. But the numbness didn't come. The image of the scar remained, burned into his retinas. It was a mark of honor. And he had treated it like a mark of shame. For the first time in his adult life, Sergeant First Class Marcus Hogan had absolutely no idea what to do. The days following the incident in the PT hall were surreal for Maria Ramirez. She had braced herself for retaliation. In her experience, embarrassing a senior NCO was a tactical error that usually resulted in extra duty, shit details, and a permanent mark on your evaluation. But the retaliation never came. Instead, a strange, unsettling silence descended. Her squad leader, a seasoned staff sergeant named Davis, simply handed her the duty roster the next morning and said, "You're on light duty for the next 2 weeks per the first sergeant. No PT, no heavy lifting. Just admin work." He didn't meet her eyes, and he didn't ask any questions. That it was as if someone had hit the mute button on the entire incident. The silence from Hogan was the loudest of all. She passed him in the hallway twice, and both times he looked through her as if she were a ghost. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The swagger was gone, replaced by a shuffling gait and a haunted expression. It was as if the man she had confronted had been a hollow shell, and the confrontation had shattered it, revealing a frightened, confused person inside. Rumors, of course, flew through the battalion grapevine. They were soldiers. Gossip was a contact sport. Some said Hogan was getting kicked out. Others said he was on his way to a court-martial. A few of the more sympathetic ones whispered that he was seeing a therapist, that the incident had triggered some kind of breakdown. The truth, as always, was more complex. And on the third day, Maria was sitting in the chaplain's office, a small, cozy room filled with tissues and inspirational posters. Chaplain Williams, a gentle man with kind eyes and a calm voice, listened as she talked. She told him about the incident, about the humiliation, about the anger she still felt simmering beneath the surface. But she also told him something else. "He looked broken, Chaplain," she said, her voice weary. "When I showed him the scar, it was like I had physically struck him. He just crumbled. And I don't know how to feel about that. Part of me is glad he felt even a fraction of the shame he made me feel. But another part of me just feels empty." Chaplain Williams leaned forward, his hands clasped on his knees. "Specialist, can I share a theory with you? Something I've observed over many years of service?" Maria nodded. "Hogan is a classic case of a soldier who overcompensates for his insecurities by projecting an image of hypermasculinity. He's never deployed, and in a combat arms unit, that's a heavy burden. He spent his entire career trying to prove he's just as tough as the guys who have been downrange. So he becomes a tyrant about physical fitness. It's the only metric he has to measure himself against you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When you showed him that scar, you didn't just prove him wrong. You shattered his entire worldview. You showed him that real strength isn't about running the fastest or doing the most push-ups. It's about surviving the unsurvivable and continuing to serve. You held up a mirror, And he saw himself for what he really is, a man who has spent his career bullying combat veterans to hide his own shame. That's a hard thing for anyone to face. Maria absorbed his words. It didn't excuse Hogan's behavior, but it explained it. The monster she had faced in the PT hall wasn't a monster at all. He was just a scared, insecure man in a position of power, and power, when held by the insecure, always turned to cruelty. The chaplain continued. He came to see me, you know. Yesterday late. He was in bad shape. Crying, actually. He asked me if I thought you would ever forgive him. Maria's heart skipped a beat. The image of the iron-fisted first sergeant crying in this very chair was almost impossible to conjure. What did you tell him? I told him that forgiveness wasn't my call to make. It was yours, and that before he could even ask for it, he had to do the work of understanding why he did what he did. He's started that work. He's requested a transfer to a training command, and he's seeing a counselor. I think for the first time in his life, he's actually looking inward. That night, Maria lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The anger was still there, a hard knot in her chest, but it was no longer a burning flame. It was a cold, heavy stone. The chaplain's words echoed in her mind. Forgiveness. It seemed impossible. Hogan had tried to break her in front of her peers. He had mocked her pain, her sacrifice. He had treated her like a liar and a coward. But as she lay there, she thought about the cost of holding on to the anger. It was heavy. It was exhausting. It was another weight on top of the PTSD, the physical pain, the survivor's guilt. Hogan had become another symptom of her trauma, a living, breathing trigger she had to carry around the battalion. As long as she hated him, he still had power over her. As long as she saw him as the monster, she was still the victim. She didn't want to be the victim anymore. She had survived an IED. She had survived the long, painful recovery. She had survived the nightmares and the flashbacks. She could survive this. But surviving wasn't the same as living. And carrying this hatred was slowly poisoning her. She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she didn't see the flash of the explosion when she closed her eyes. She saw Hogan's face, not as it was during the confrontation, smug and cruel, but as it was in the hallway the other day, pale, lost, and ashamed. And it was the face of a man who had finally seen himself clearly and who was terrified by what he saw. In that moment, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of her anger. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the possibility of it, and that, she realized, was a start. 6 months later, the change of command ceremony was a blur of starched uniforms, brass instruments, and precisely executed drill movements. Specialist Maria Ramirez, now promoted to sergeant based on a meritorious board that had finally recognized her true value, stood in the rear rank of her platoon. The Colorado sun was warm now, a stark contrast to that bitter morning in the PT hall. Her new rank felt heavy on her collar, a weight she carried with pride. As the ceremony concluded and the formations began to break, she saw him. Sergeant First Class Hogan stood apart from the crowd, a moving box at his feet. He was in his dress uniform, looking older than she remembered, his hair grayer at the temples. He was waiting, she realized, waiting for her. She hesitated for a moment, the old anger flickering briefly in her chest. But it was weaker now, a faint echo of its former self. She had spent the last 6 months in therapy, both physical and mental. She had learned to manage the pain, to quiet the nightmares. She had also learned a great deal about Hogan. He had, as the chaplain predicted, done the work. He had transferred to a training battalion at Fort Leonard Wood, a job that would keep him far from the front lines, far from the combat soldiers he had once tormented. This was his last day at Fort Carson. And she excused herself from her squad and walked toward him. He saw her coming and visibly tensed, but he didn't look away. When she stopped in front of him, they stood in silence for a long moment, the noise of the ceremony fading into the background. "Sergeant Ramirez," he said, his voice formal but soft. "Congratulations on the promotion. You earned it." "Thank you, First Sergeant," she replied. He looked down at the box at his feet, then back up at her. His eyes were clear, free of the defensive hostility she had once seen in them. They were the eyes of a man who had done some hard thinking. "I'm not going to ask for your forgiveness," he said quietly. "I don't have the right. What I did to you was unforgivable. I was a coward. I hid behind my rank and my mouth because I was terrified of being found out. I found out that I wasn't the soldier I pretended to be." He took a shaky breath. "You showed me that. Not by yelling, not by reporting me, but by having the guts to stand there and show me the truth. You were braver in that one moment than I have been in my entire career." Maria listened, saying nothing. She watched the emotions play across his face, shame, regret, and a fragile hope. "I'm not the same man I was," he continued. "I'm seeing a therapist. I'm learning about myself, about why I did the things I did. It's ugly work, but it's necessary, and I owe that to you. You forced me to look in the mirror." He finally met her eyes directly. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Ramirez. I am so sorry for the pain I caused you. I know those words are empty, but they're all I have." The silence stretched between them. Maria thought about the long road she had traveled, the IED, the hospital, the PT hall, the months of therapy. She thought about the scar, still purple and angry, hidden beneath her dress uniform. It was a part of her, a permanent reminder of what she had lost and what she had survived. Hogan was a part of that journey now, too. A painful part, but a part nonetheless. She reached out her hand. Hogan stared at it for a second, disbelief flickering in his eyes, before he slowly reached out and took it. His grip was gentle, tentative. "I see you," Maria said softly. "I see the man who was cruel, and I see the man standing here now. I don't know if I can forgive the first one, but I can acknowledge the second." She squeezed his hand once, then let go. "Good luck in Missouri, First Sergeant. I hope you find some peace." She turned and walked back toward her unit, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't look back. Behind her, Hogan stood motionless for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been. Then slowly he bent down, picked up his box, and walked toward the parking lot where his car waited to take him to a new life. As Maria rejoined her squad, a young private, the same one who had handed her the water bottle months ago, fell into step beside her. "Who was that, Sergeant?" he asked. Maria glanced back once, seeing the distant figure of Hogan placing the box in his trunk. "Just someone I used to know," she said, and it was true. The Hogan of the PT hall was gone, a ghost of a man she no longer needed to fear. In his place was just a flawed human being, trying to find his way, much like herself. And the scar on her abdomen twinged, a familiar ache. But for the first time, it felt less like a wound and more like a badge of survival, of strength, and of the quiet, unbreakable dignity of a soldier who had faced the worst the world had to offer and was still standing.